Namaste. Welcome to Beyond Asana, Yoga, and Spirituality in the West. My name is Betsy, and I am the host of this podcast. Today's episode, we are going to be talking about Neo-Tantra. However, before we get into that, I am hoping that you'll go beyond this podcast and come on over and join me on Instagram. And that would be at the.niamis.travel.project. So come hang out with me over there. It'll be fun. Also, this is the very first episode of the podcast. Welcome. So, I do want to let you know in advance, this is a two-part episode. The topic Neo-Tantra will be discussed in this episode and the second episode, because it was much longer than I thought it was going to be. So I cut it into two parts. So in the first part today, we are going to be talking about just generally what is Neo-Tantra, where does it come from, and the early influencers of the movement. The men that first sort of brought these ideas to the West. Then in the second episode next week, we will discuss two gentlemen that were working in the mid to late 20th centuries, and then talk about right now. So, be sure to come back next week for that. So, here we are. Let's get into it. So again, today's topic is Neo-Tantra. What have you heard about Neo-Tantra? Most probably, if you've heard the term Neo-Tantra before, you heard it associated with sex or sex magic or sex yoga. And in popular Western culture, it's a lot of times looked down upon. But where did this tradition come from? I would suggest that it comes from a few lesser-known teachings from classical Tantra that were translated through a Western magic and occult lens. According to neotantra.org, a contemporary website which states, quote, Neo-Tantra is the modern Western form of how to practice Tantric techniques. Traditionally, the Tantric practices are ultimately a path to enlightenment and infinite bliss, taught in Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. So, end quote. The author continues, quote, to my understanding, anything expanding consciousness, connecting to spirit, and seeing the divine in all is seen as the Tantric path, involving rituals and practices to liberate the soul. One definition of Tantra is that it is a body of teachings, a spiritual tradition of bringing the unconscious into the conscious, realizing that we are one, an expression of Shiva and Shakti in sacred union, end quote. Another source, Sama Karuna, an organization that provides neo-tantric retreats, states, quote, the goal of Neo-Tantra is to help people in their personal growth through physical, sexual, psychological, and spiritual development. By practicing it, you can access greater freedom and inner love, end quote. From these two descriptions, the idea of sex or sexuality is not overtly discussed. However, if you type Neo-Tantra into, say, Amazon, the first search page returns titles that include things like Tantric Sex, The Truth About Tantric Sex. Another book title, Tantric Sex for Beginners, Tantric Sex for Couples, Sex Positions Illustrated, and Teaching Yourself Tantric Sex. Here we can see how Neo-Tantra is treated in a monolithic manner in terms of sort of pop culture, whereas the websites provide a more nuanced, complex take on the topic of Neo-Tantra. In addition to these websites, medical websites also have information about Tantric sex. For instance, Medical News Today describes Tantric sex as, quote, a slow, meditative form of sex where the end goal is not orgasm, but enjoying the sexual journey and sensations of the body. It aims to move sexual energy throughout the body for healing, transformation, and enlightenment, end quote. And WebMD says, quote, the goal of Tantric sex is to achieve a spiritual or energetic contract during a sensual experience, end quote. So these medical websites do expound upon these ideas about sex, but going beyond sort of sex. I don't know. However, I would say, so these websites do sort of express this spiritual connection to sex, which I think is helpful and beneficial. However, classical Tantra does not put sex front and center. Like any religious or spiritual tradition, there are different lineages. So some Tantric lineages do have sex practices, and others, of course, do not. So before we go any further in this topic, I'm going to give you a little background on Shaiva Tantra. So the Tantric tradition is founded in both Shaivism and Buddhism. And the information I'm going to give you here today is based on Shaiva Tantra because that is what I'm most familiar with. So according to Dr. Christopher Wallace, the earliest texts and inscriptions that we could call Tantric date from the 5th to the 7th centuries CE. And these texts show up at roughly the same time in both Shaivism and Buddhism. Furthermore, there are two streams of Tantra. One is often referred to as the right-handed path, and the other, the left-handed path. So the right-handed path is a dualistic tradition that emphasizes the worshiping of Shiva and Shakti. Those on the right-handed path believe that liberation comes from a ritual initiation and ritual practices. Furthermore, they were not interested in challenging the social norms. Instead, they sought acceptance among the Brahmin priests of Vedic society. The people who followed the left-handed path were following some of these ideas from which Neo-Tantra comes. And this path emphasizes the worship of the female divinities and fierce deities. So the tradition also taught that liberation could be attained while still living, not just before death. Liberation was attained through the cultivation of insight and yoga. Furthermore, the left-handed stream of Tantra did challenge societal norms in a variety of ways. According to Wallace, they empowered women and performed rituals with transgressive elements. Within the left-handed stream, there were different sects or lineages. And for lack of a better term, you could say they got successively more extreme, with the Krama tradition being the most extreme when compared with societal norms at the time, and the Kaula, Trika, and Trika traditions, while also being on the left-handed paths, they were less extreme than the Krama. Scholar David Gordon White explains that, quote, "There was and remains an authentic body of precept and practice known as Kaula or Tantra, which has been, among other things, a sexualization of ritual, as opposed to a ritualization of sex, one of the many fundamental errors on the part of present-day tantric sex entrepreneurs." And in this discussion, we'll come back later to present-day tantric sex entrepreneurs. Thus, just because Western culture is inundated with the ideas of Neo-Tantra, the traditional lineages can still be accessed. So, you may be wondering, where did Neo-Tantra come from? Hugh Urban states in his article, Magi Sexualists, Sex and Secrecy and Liberation in Modern Western Esotericism, that Tantra has a long and rather scandalous reputation in both India and the West, and in a large part because of its use of the physical body, sensual pleasures, and in some cases, sexual intercourse as means of spiritual liberation. However, as Tantra entered the Western world in the 19th and 20th centuries, it would become increasingly identified with its sexual aspects and increasingly defined simply as spiritual sex. So how did this play out in practice? Throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, the Neo-Tantric movement was promoted and progressed by personal movements headed by charismatic men. After the 1980s, it seems that Neo-Tantra became less centralized around individuals and began playing out more in the realm of pop culture or in wellness spheres, including tantric yoga retreats and tantric massage. And so we're going to start by discussing some of these individuals who brought Neo-Tantra to the West, and then a few figures who were working in the mid-late 20th century. It's important to look at the late 19th century and Victorian culture to understand how these obscure tantric practices came to prominence in the Western occult. So, we will begin this story with the occult, meaning the supernatural, mystical, or magical beliefs, practices, or phenomena. In the article, The Rise of 19th Century American Spiritualism, 1854 to 1873, newspaper reports confirm that nearly 800 American cities and towns were involved in spiritual activities. And here we are defining spiritualism as talking with the dead. But this shows that Americans were open to alternative religious and spiritual forms in the mid-1800s. The introduction of sex into the occult doesn't start with the infusion of Tantra, but begins with Paschal Beverly Randolph. Randolph was born in 1825 to a wealthy Virginian father and a mother who was a slave from Madagascar. He was raised as a free black in New York City. Sadly, at the age of 7, he was orphaned. Then as a teenager, he ran away from his foster parents' home to travel the world. Who could blame him? I would do the same. Honestly. So upon his return to the United States, he emerged as a leading spiritualist and famous sorcerer, meaning a crystal seer. In addition to this, he was an outspoken advocate of black rights and a feminist, so clearly he was before his time, both spiritually and politically. So he traveled through Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. As he traveled, he encountered a variety of esoteric traditions, meaning ideas that were intended for a small number of people with specialized knowledge. Randolph encountered European spiritualists and Rosarian orders, which are basically secret societies. He also met Sufis from various lineages. So Sufism is the mystic lineage of Islam. However, he claims that much of his ideas about sex magic came from experiences he had in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. He said, quote, "One night, it was in far-off Jerusalem or Bethlehem, I really forget which. I made love to and was loved by a dusky maiden of Arabic blood. I of her and that experience learned not directly, but by suggestion, the fundamental principle of the white magic of love," end quote. After this, he met a group of fakirs, and they may have been a branch of the Orthodox mystical order Narairi, a group that allegedly practiced Gnostic sexual rituals. For Randolph, these spiritual sex practices were meant to be performed between a husband and wife, and the climax of both individuals, especially at the same time, was important. He believed this was necessary to result in the partners feeling that the union is the overflowing joy of the divine emanating from above, like the breath of God. Of course, this was an affront to much of Victorian culture. In his memoir, P.B. Randolph, His Curious Life, Works, and Career, Randolph recounts a time when he was arrested and then tried for distributing immoral, free love literature. And Randolph depicts the prosecutor as, quote, finding nothing worse to say than that Randolph encourages women to think of themselves as equals to men, end quote. So, I think Randolph being arrested and tried for distributing literature on sex magic shows there was an audience and obviously opponents at the time, which I would say corresponds to today. So the next figure to bring sex magic to the masses was Aleister Crowley, also known as the Great Beast and the wickedest man on earth. He's also one of the most important figures in bringing Tantra, or a modified form of Tantra, to the West. Crowley was born in the United Kingdom on October 12, 1875. He subsequently passed away in the UK on December 1st, 1947. At the age of 20, Crowley went to Trinity College in Cambridge to study natural science tripos. In October of 1897, his life changed when he had a fevered vision, and this vision convinced him that all human endeavors are ephemeral, with one exception, the magic tradition, meaning the only thing that lasts for any extended amount of time is, of course, magic. After this, Crowley dedicated himself to esoteric studies and sought initiation into an organization by a genuine magi. He began spending time with others who were interested in esoteric ideas and wandering the globe. Sometime between 1900 and 1902, Crowley traveled to Asia and practiced Hatha Yoga. Now, Crowley was probably practicing traditional Hatha Yoga, which is a topic for another podcast, but it's not exactly what we refer to today in the West as Hatha Yoga. Anyway, between 1905 and 1909, he took a hiatus from his occult activities, but by 1909 he began recruiting for his own esoteric order, the Argenteum Austrium, which translates as Silver Star. Through his activities, Crowley met a young poet named Victor Newberg. The two worked together, combining their magical and homosexual pursuits to produce a form of sex magic. Furthermore, in 1910, Crowley joined the Ordos Temple Orientis, and this group was founded in either Germany or Austria between 1895 and 1906 by Karl Kellner. The organization was along the lines of the Freemasons, and this is where Crowley was first introduced to Tantra. During the First World War, Crowley moved to the States, and then in 1920 he moved to Italy and rented a farmhouse known as the Abbey Thelma, where he accepted disciples in hopes of advancing the new eon. But this project was ended by 1923 when a man mysteriously died at the Abbey. After this, the Italian government expelled Crowley and his followers from the country. And by 1940s, he was back in the UK, and by this time he had perfected his message, a blend of Western magic and Eastern mysticism, including Gnosticism, Tantric Buddhism, along with modern science, including Freudian psychology. As I stated earlier, Crowley participated in same-sexual activities. For Crowley and his followers, sexual magic was a powerful source of transgression. Thus, the same-sex coupling was itself a form of transgression, as homosexuality was not widely accepted at the time. For Crowley, sex was the most powerful force in human nature, and the supreme expression of will. Not surprisingly, he believed sex had been repressed by the church, which was the cause of social and psychological problems. He was also very interested in sexual fluids. And yes, in yoga there are discussions of sexual fluids, especially in the Hatha tradition, and this has little relation to what might be considered Hatha today in the West, again. However, in the historical Hatha tradition, the practitioners, primarily men, were supposed to conserve their bindu, or semen. Conserving their semen helped them retain power, thus they abstained from intercourse and masturbation. Crowley, on the other hand, had other ideas. Apparently, his practices included the consumption of sexual fluids, both from men and women. In addition to this, Crowley incorporated other aspects of yoga into his practices. He was particularly interested in the niyamas, the second of Patanjali's 8-limbed yoga system. The niyamas are ways in which you conduct yourself. They include saucha, or cleanliness, both in mind, body, and your surroundings; santosha, or contentment; tapas, which is self-discipline; svadhyaya, which is self-study; and isvara pranidhana, or surrender, specifically to a higher power. And within his organization, the priestess represented the divine energy, which in Tantra is called Shakti, and the priest represented the divine masculine, or Shiva. So in another podcast, I want to revisit Crowley and all of the yogic aspects he incorporated into his beliefs. But we don't have time for that here. So next we are going to look at Pierre Arnold Bernard. was probably born in 1875 to a family in California. Like Randolph, Bernard left home as a teen to travel. He worked his way to India, and while there he studied Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, and many historical religious works were written in Sanskrit. He also studied methods of curing disease of mind and body. Though I did not read this directly, I would assume in part this meant he was studying Ayurveda, the ancient Indian form of medicine, which is still practiced today. Bernard also claims he was initiated into the inner mysteries of Tantra. After returning to the States, he worked odd jobs and studied hypnosis. By 1900, he was somewhat famous as a master of hypnosis who could use yogic techniques. By 1900, he was somewhat famous as a master of hypnosis who could use yogic techniques to bring himself into a state of simulated death. In 1904, he established a clinic in San Francisco where he taught self-hypnosis and yoga. During this time, he began causing a stir because he catered to young women. Then, in 1906, he established the first Tantric order in the United States, called the Tantric Order of America. The order had an accompanying journal which stated information about initiations, and one article read, quote, "As a tear from heaven, he has been dropped into the ocean of the Tantric Brotherhood upon earth and is moored forever in the harbor of contentment, at the door to the temple of wisdom, and to him will be unveiled the knowledge of the Most High." End quote. So eventually Bernard moved to a large 72-acre estate in Nyack, New York, which was named Clarkstown Country Club. This was the site of his own utopian tantric community. In a newspaper article, Bernard's tantric rituals were described like this, quote, "During tantric ceremonies, Om sat on his throne wearing a turban, a silken robe, and baggy Turkish pants, and flourished a scepter. While so engaged, he invariably smoked one of the long black cigars to which he was addicted. The Novite looked upon Dr. Bernard as a high priest, indeed as a sort of man god. The Novite looks upon Dr. Bernard as a high priest, indeed as a sort of man god. He kneels before Dr. Bernard and recites, 'Be to me a living guru. Be a loving tantric guru.' Then all present bow their heads and repeat in unison, 'Om Man Na Padma Om.' It is sung over and over in a chanting monotone like the beating of drums in a forest, and is supposed to induce a state of ecstasy." End quote. So I'm surmising that the phrase Om Man Na Padma Om is a play on the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, which translates as independence on the practice of a path which is an indivisible union of method and wisdom. As we saw for Randolph, the sex act was supposed to be between a man and woman in a spiritual union. For Crowley, it was a transgressive act, seemingly against the world that surrounded him. And for Bernard, sex was a spiritual discipline and a means of realizing the divine with the physical body. Each of these men's ideas have been used throughout the 20th century and now the 21st century to promote Neo-Tantra. One other individual who was alive in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that had an effect on how the West understood Tantra was author Arthur Avalon. Although, as far as I can tell, he did not start any organizations, he did write many books on the topic of Tantra, including The Serpent Power, which is a translation of a Sanskrit text on the chakras and principles of Tantra. Arthur Avalon, whose real name is John Woodruff, was a court barrister of the High Court of Calcutta from 1900 to 1904. At this point, he was promoted to the judiciary, and he remained in this position until 1922. During his time as a barrister, he also taught law at Calcutta University. Avalon's encounter with Tantric ideas was quite different from those of Bernard and Crowley. He was interacting with and holding conversations with people from a range of backgrounds, including South Asian intellectuals, Western Orientalists, missionaries, esotericists, and others just generally interested in the intersection of religion, philosophy, science, and national identity. Though Avalon's ideas did not come together to create a cult, his writings were and are still accessed as a major source of Tantra information. According to Julian Straub, his works, as in Avalon's works, were considered the main reference for Tantra, and he is credited with creating the academic study of Tantra. So I just thought he deserved a mention in case anyone is interested in looking him up. So that is where we are going to leave this topic for today. We will pick up next week and finish off next week with this topic of Neo-Tantra by talking about some gentlemen who were working here in the United States in the mid-late 20th century, Rajneesh and Chongyam Trungpa. We'll discuss these two men next week, along with those modern Neo-Tantric Neo-Tantric sex entrepreneurs. So I look forward to meeting you here again next week. I hope you have a wonderful day. I will leave you with Om Shanti Shanti Shanti, and may peace be with you throughout the rest of your day and the rest of the week. Have a good one, and I hope to catch up with you on Instagram. Bye.